Hi, I'm Elaine Holden, and this is Education Matters here on Channel 96 in Nashua, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I talk about something related to childhood, education, perhaps even learning across the lifespan. Today, I want to sort of feed off of what I did last week. I was talking last week about language, specifically the English language, and how it was formed. A little bit of the history of the language, the Anglo-Saxon layer, the Latin or Romance layer, where we have Spanish and Latin and French and Portuguese and all those lovely Romance languages, and the top layer, which is the Greek layer. And those are the primary languages that feed into what we now know as English. There are probably around 150 different languages that have contributed to English. Maybe it's only just a few words. Maybe it's half a dozen, maybe it's 2 dozen, but there are any number of languages that have given us one or more words that we have very happily incorporated into English, which is why we have close to 1 million words in the English language, probably 450,000 to even 650,000 that are currently in common use. And as I said, we can get by every day just using those glue words, those Anglo-Saxon words. But the enrichment of the language comes from the Romance layer and the Greek layer, as well as, obviously, all those other languages that contribute. But now I want to talk a little bit more about not just English, but the acquisition of English as a second language. Why do I talk about this? Well, here in America, we seem to have some kind of a phobia about other languages. And you're probably thinking back and saying, well, no, let me think. Yeah, people seem to be a little nervous about learning another language or even coming into America and not speaking English. Maybe we are a little bit phobic. Where did that come from? Well, believe it or not, we're going to have to go back around 122 years, almost 123 years now, to the turn of the last century. Why? Because we had an influx of immigrants. Things were hitting the fan in Europe. We had all kinds of wars and battles and upheavals, social upheavals, financial upheavals. There were all kinds of things going on. It was very volatile in Europe, politically volatile, socially volatile. Things were happening all over the place. And so what did we see? We saw large waves of immigrants from a wide variety of countries coming to America. And there was a fear that these folks would be coming in and taking over what we think of as America, or what was thought of as America in those days. And so we had basically a white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Scotch, Irish, English heritage, so that the people that settled here were, for the most part, from Northern Europe. They were, for the most part, English-speaking, mostly agrarian, remember. These were small-time farmers. We didn't have those big farms in those days. We had small farms. We had people that grew crops or raised cattle, but they were very self-sufficient folks, okay? And not many people lived in cities. So we had that kind of tradition, and suddenly the gates open, the floodgates open, and here comes all of these immigrants, all of them speaking different languages, all of them coming to America mostly because they weren't surviving in Europe and they needed a place to come that was safe, where they could really raise families and have a good life. And America was the place for it. America still is the place for it, let's face it. So now we have all of these folks not speaking English coming to America, and the fear happens that these people will take over for what we had and I'm saying we, I wasn't born at the turn of the last century, but what we had as a culture and changing it. And so the pressure was on to make sure that these adults, as well as their children, assimilated into American life and American culture as quickly as possible. And we actually, if you look back into the history of, for example, home economics, it was called domestic science, and I have no idea what it is now, but you know, cooking and sewing and how to go shopping in a grocery store and take care of a baby, that kind of thing. Well, that started in the 7th grade. These kids, especially girls, got put into domestic science, and they learned to cook American food, and they learned to shop for American food. And it was a course that was really insisted upon for all females. And this home economics course, or domestic science course, was designed to help the females assimilate into American culture. And we see the same thing with woodworking classes for the boys and automotive classes for the boys. Now, we didn't have too much for automotive in those days, obviously, but we had a lot for woodworking and other sort of machine shop activities. And it was really to get everybody assimilated into the American culture as quickly as possible. Make them good Americans. And that allayed the fears of all of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant farmers who were afraid of losing what they had. So that is an understandable sort of reaction to people speaking a second language. And the pressure was on to make sure that the children who were born in America spoke English from the very earliest times, so that when they went into school, it would not be a challenge for the teachers to teach these children English. And it's understandable, all right, because we had a huge influx of immigrants, and we also had children that were born to these immigrants here in America who really did not hear English until they went to school. So to sort of deal with that, the pressure was on to have these children learn English from the get-go. Perfectly understandable. Now, we had a fairly solid English-speaking population after these waves of immigrants. The celerity of the language was pretty clear. We did not have a lot of second or third language instruction or you know, a lot of, you know, people coming in as immigrants to bring in other languages. So the stability for the population was pretty clear until we started to see greater waves coming in more recently, okay? Say in the 70s and 80s. We see people coming in from Southeast Asia, South America, etc. So we're now seeing more immigrants coming in from other countries with their own languages. But there is a fear, a continuous fear about acquisition of another language. And this, I think, is a detrimental thing. Now, we have to separate politics and education, and we have to really take a close look at learning second languages or third languages. In Europe, in Asia, and in parts of Africa, as well as the subcontinent of India, we're seeing English being taught on a very regular basis. And it's not just English, it's French, and depending upon influences from other cultures, we're seeing other languages being taught. Most predominantly, we see in Europe children learning at a very early age, and I'm talking 3 or 4, a second, a third, and even a fourth language. So that by the time these children are in the 7th grade, they are completely proficient in the language of their particular country, and they're also proficient usually in English and French or German, and it stands to reason that they are able to have conversations on the playground, in the classroom, whenever, because they are so comfortable with these other languages. So let's take a look at the research for a little bit. when we look at the research, what we see is that children who have a second language, who have learned a second language at a very early age, are more capable cognitively, for the most part, than children that are monolingual. So in other words, if you have a child that's exposed to two languages, even from birth, by age 3 or 4, that child is able to tease out one language from another. So if somebody comes over to a child and, for example, speaks to the child in Dutch, that child, if that child is a bilingual Dutch-English speaker, will answer that person in Dutch. If you ask the child a question in English, the child will respond in English. The child is able to process two languages with very little difficulty. Why is that? Well, neurologically, what we see is that the brain, when the child is born, the brain is prepared to learn any language. And when up to like as early as 4 hours after birth, that child is starting to tune into the prosody, the rhythm of the language, we start to see the brain growing and responding to that, what we call the cradle tongue, the language that the primary caregiver speaks to the child. And all of those neurons, all of those connectors, all of that preparation for those other languages sort of gets pared away. So that what's left is that language sort of superhighway for the cradle tongue, for the language of the primary caregiver. But if you have a child who hears two languages, all of that sort of mechanism in there that is designed to acquire another language remains, and it stays, and it grows. And as the child hears the two languages, that child is able to start making distinctions between language A and language B, say English and Dutch. So, as I said, by the time the child's 3 or 4, they've got it all figured out. Even if that child goes into school at the age of 6 and perhaps doesn't hear Dutch again, but in junior high or middle school or high school is then exposed to a second language, or in this case, a third language, their ability to acquire that other language is really quite good because that neurological structure is still there. It's very cool stuff. Bottom line is that if you have a child who can speak two languages, that child is generally thought of to have as a cognitive advantage, all right, as well as more flexibility of thought and having a better, what I hate to say, IQ. The IQ numbers seem to creep up for these kids. And I talked about IQ a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about exposure and a child having had enough exposure and having had enough experiences to really be able to do well on an IQ test. So it makes sense that these kids look better on IQ tests because they most likely have had more exposure and more positive experiences and most likely more educational experiences. So why am I talking about this right now? We have probably around 2.6 million students here in America who do not speak English. I want to say about 75% of that 2.6 million or so are Spanish speaking, and the rest usually speak Asian or some other, an Asian language, Chinese, Japanese, whatever, and some African dialects and some Indian languages. So you've got a smattering of other languages. But the thing that concerns me the most is that when these children come into school and they're not responding because they're not speaking English, they're at a significant disadvantage. The reaction in the school systems nationwide is, of course, to test the children. What does this mean? It means that these children are tested with instruments that are designed for and normed on English-speaking children. Because these children cannot speak English, because they have not had the exposure, they do very poorly on these tests. Most frequently, these are the children that now get coded as special needs or special education. They get labeled as learning disabled. The reality is they are, for the most part, not learning disabled. And this puts an extra burden on our special needs system. It also means that these children are isolated, segregated, taken out of the mainstream population, and in many instances, this curtails their access to education. These are the ones that drop out early. These are the ones that are not given an education commensurate with their intellectual abilities. And it puts a huge burden on special education. The minute a burden on special education increases, that ramps up our taxes. Special education is designed for children who have special needs, who have a learning disability, not for children who don't speak English. I'm not saying that there aren't children who don't speak English that aren't dyslexic or have a learning disability. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is a disproportionate number of children who don't speak English get pushed into special education. And this is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for schools, not a good thing for the children, and it's costing us too much money. So what do? Well, we've got to make some decisions here. We also have to recognize that we can no longer be afraid of acquiring other languages. It's been 122 years, which means even though we have that fear still kind of carried with us about losing our culture and having so many people not assimilating into the American culture, we know from history that after the second generation, the assimilation is almost complete. Think back to your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Think of how they came to America, didn't speak English, got jobs, put their kids through school, their kids got better jobs, they all spoke English. English is acquired. Within 2 generations, I guarantee you, assimilation happens. So that fear has to be kind of brushed away. But now we have to look at the education process for our children. And what do we see? We see 1 or 2 years in high school, sort of, we need to take Spanish, we need to take French, we need to take Latin, we need to take something. Why? Because the college that I want to get into says I have to. That's the wrong way to learn a language. We should, in fact, have our children started with a second language at a very early age. We should teach it and mean it. It should be immersion. It should be oral language. It shouldn't be read this book. It should, in fact, be we're all going to be on the playground speaking Spanish, or we're going to be in the gymnasium speaking French. We're going to have enough of an immersion so that these children become truly bilingual. It helps them intellectually. It increases their cognitive ability, as I said. It increases their flexibility of thought. There's so much positive to learning a second and even a third language. How do we know this? Let's look at Europe again. Europe has settled down quite a bit, by the way, in 122 years. So we know that the European educational experience is quite excellent. And these children are the examples that we use to really point out the advantages of learning a second or third language. So to not do that, to not offer this to our children is really not a good idea. What's interesting also is that if you look at the more affluent areas in our country, what you're going to see is the expectation that children are truly bilingual. And if you have that as an expectation and you have it as a cultural norm, the bilingual experience and the true ability to speak another language is so prized that if a child doesn't speak a second language, that child kind of gets looked down on. So you have to look at it from that way as well. The rich people, the people that are well educated, the people that are really in the know, are making sure that their children have another language so that their children are truly bilingual. Why is that such a push? Well, think about it from an international standpoint. We are a truly global world, a global economy. And people who speak a second language can get a job, an international level job, an attorney level job, a sales level job, jobs that will allow them to interact with other cultures and other languages. They make more money. People that go into the diplomatic corps do very nicely if they speak a second language, and in many cases it's required. And so if you're going into the diplomatic corps, yeah, you're probably going to need a second language, and parents who have that aspiration for their children make sure that their children get that experience early on, and they keep that language up, and if necessary, push them into a third language. And of course, as I said at the beginning of this show, what do we know? Those neurons are there, that mechanism is there, and those are the kids that do better learning a third language. So, what's the takeaway on this? I first have to realize that there is a movement, what's called English First, and that was actually pushed by Dr. Sessue Hayakawa. And Dr. Hayakawa was a brilliant linguist. He was also a senator from California, and he was the one that was pushing English first. His ideas kind of got perverted a little bit to this English-only idea. But what Dr. Hayakawa said was, look, to streamline the process in America, we need to have just one language for the government. I hope you realize we don't have a national language. I know we all speak English, or most of us speak English, but it is not a national language. We don't have one. There is no legislation, there is no law anywhere on any book that says that we must absolutely have English as our one and only language. There are other countries that have that, but not us. So we don't have an English-only law. English First is for government use, and so that all documents are written only in English. Now that rarely gets even a footnote at the national level. At the state level, however, we have a number of states that actually have English First, and that's only for government documents. And that includes New Hampshire, by the way. I think we passed it in 1985, maybe 1995. Yeah, probably 95. Bottom line, government documents are what English First is all about. English only is something that most people shun away from because that really has an impact, not just on people coming in from Asia and Europe, but also on our Native American population. Our Native American population has suffered dramatically over the generations. Remember all those schools, those schools that the Native American kids were put into, and they were beaten and starved and had horrible things done to them when they spoke, when they were caught speaking in their native tongue. And this is the sort of thing where we cannot afford to let that happen again. We cannot have this happen to any child. A child comes into a school situation, and that child speaks the language that is spoken in his or her home. They don't have governance over what they learn as a language. So they should not be castigated for it. They should not be punished for it. However, they should be allowed to keep the language, their cradle tongue. They should be allowed to use their language. There is no law that says they cannot. Of course, we want them to learn English as a second language, but we want them to keep their native language, their cradle tongue, the language of their home, because that gives them an advantage cognitively. And we want that for all children. And so when we're looking at English as a primary language, we're looking at it for government purposes. We have to understand that within 2 generations, children, adults, their children will in fact assimilate into the culture. We have 122 years worth of research to document this. There really is no fear of losing English, of losing our culture. Our nation is too big to have that happen. So English will most likely always remain as our primary language, with or without legislation. People who come to America will assimilate within 2 generations. Children will learn English on the playground. Those are givens, okay? It is better to allow children to have their primary language, their cradle tongue, to support it and give them instruction sufficient in English to allow them to be proficient in the English language so that they can assimilate more easily and they can acquire all of the education that they need without having to be shunted off into special education after they've been incorrectly evaluated and identified. And put our energies into having our children, our native-born English-speaking children, learning a second language at a very early age, learning it at the oral level, learning it on the playground, learning it in enough of an immersion situation so that they actually do become proficient in that second language, because that will be to their benefit when they become adults. It will be to their benefit in the workplace. It will be to their benefit culturally. There's any number of cognitive benefits that we know about. And we also know that as people age, the recommendations are very clear. You want to keep your brain as supple as possible. You want to keep your brain from deteriorating into some type of dementia. One of the best ways to do it is to learn a second language. It's tougher as you get older, but it is just as important as it is for a youngster. It's just as important for a senior citizen as it is a youngster. I did a show a few months ago on the importance of learning music, and what did I say? That's the other thing that helps people keep their cognitive resources when they're getting into those golden years. Learning music. Music and language, those are the 2 big ones. So I hope you kind of really think about this over the week and think about acquiring a second language and supporting children in getting a second language as early as possible. There's nothing to be afraid of. Please let me assure you, we're not going to lose our culture. We're not going to lose English. English is here to stay. But we can enhance all of our children's educational opportunities by supporting and providing them with a second language, whatever language you happen to choose. Thank you for joining me today. I've enjoyed being with you, and I will be with you again. Elaine Holden, Education Matters.